My name is Joanna Reed. I am 32 years old. I serve as a major in the United States Army. I have spent my career in places most people only hear about on the evening news. I have been in sandstorms so thick you could not see the man beside you. I have walked through markets where a single wrong glance could get you followed. I have stood in rooms where a decision made in silence kept people alive. None of that mattered to my father, not in his world. "You're just a lowly soldier," he said, his voice smooth and amused, carrying easily over the low hum of conversation. The laughter around the long mahogany table was polite, but it still cut. He leaned back in his leather chair, swirling amber scotch as though the glass itself was part of his power. The men and women seated here were his kind of people. Corporate titans, politicians, the kind of players who closed deals over dessert. I kept my face still. Years in the military had taught me that silence can be more effective than any retort. My hand rested lightly against the linen tablecloth as I listened to the clink of crystal glasses, the scrape of a knife against porcelain. Then I saw him. He was standing near the service entrance, half in shadow, wearing a suit that did nothing to disguise the tension in his posture. I recognized that face instantly. 2 years ago in Kabul, his photo had been part of a classified briefing. A contract assassin, confirmed kills in 3 countries, disappeared without a trace. And now he was here, 30 feet away, scanning the room with eyes that missed nothing. And I saw who he was watching. 2 seats down from my father, in animated conversation with a U.S. Senator, sat General Marcus Hale. 4 stars, Army Chief of Staff. A man who had commanded thousands, whose word could move units across continents. The assassin wasn't here for small talk. My pulse spiked, but my training took over. I lowered my gaze to my lap, slid my phone out of my clutch, and tapped open a secure line. One known to exactly 3 people. Marcus Hale was one of them. My thumbs moved fast. "Get up and leave, now, don't ask why." I hit send. Across the table, Hale paused mid-sentence. He reached for his phone with a casualness that looked rehearsed, glanced at the screen, then let his eyes lift to mine. The contact lasted less than a heartbeat. Then he rose from his chair. "Senator, let's finish this conversation tomorrow," he said, and his voice was so even that no one blinked. He stepped away from the table, his aides nowhere in sight. My father's fork hovered halfway to his mouth. "What?" He never finished. The assassin pushed off from the wall, shadowing Hale toward the exit. That was when the 2 aides appeared, seemingly from nowhere, moving to intercept. The exchange was silent, controlled. A piece of choreography I had seen before. In places where no one else understood what was happening until it was over. The table buzzed with the continuation of conversations about market trends and lobbying efforts. My father stared after the departing figures, his lips pressing into a line. I returned my gaze to my plate, the taste of restraint familiar on my tongue. He didn't know what I had just done. He didn't know that the daughter he called lowly had just prevented something that would have shattered this room and sent shockwaves far beyond it. And for now, I was content to keep it that way. The morning air was cool, the kind that carried a faint bite even through the steam rising from my coffee mug. I was standing on the front porch of my apartment, watching the street wake up, when the pounding started. Not the polite knock of a neighbor, the kind of knock that carried authority. I didn't have to open my phone to know the address they were headed to. By the time I arrived at my father's estate, black SUVs lined the driveway. Men and women in dark jackets moved with precision through the front doors, radios clipped to their collars. The gold crest on their shoulders caught the morning light. Interpol. I stepped inside without announcing myself. My father stood in the foyer, still in his robe, his hair rumpled, confusion twisting his features into something unfamiliar. "What is this? What is happening?" he demanded, but his voice lacked its usual command. The lead agent approached, a folder tucked under his arm. Without a word, he slid a photograph from a plastic sleeve and held it up between 2 fingers. I saw the color drain from my father's face. His eyes locked on the image, as if it could change if he stared long enough. It was him, shaking hands with the man from last night, the assassin. His lips parted, but no sound came. His gaze flicked to me for a fraction of a second, an unspoken question, an accusation, and something else I couldn't name, all tangled together. The agent's tone was neutral, professional. "We have more, but I think this is enough for now." Around us, drawers opened and closed. Boxes were carried out, the orderly chaos of a well-executed operation. I took a sip from the coffee I had brought with me, its warmth a strange contrast to the chills settling over the room. Here it was, the man who had spent years diminishing me, reducing my work to nothing more than following orders, now standing in the center of his own home as strangers dismantled his empire. And the beauty of it was that I hadn't needed to raise my voice or make a scene. He had mocked me in front of his peers. He had seen me as ornamental at best. But when the moment came, I had acted, quietly, decisively, and now he was watching the walls close in. To my father's shock, the 4-star general had obeyed my words instantly. That obedience had set off a chain of events leading to this morning, to this photograph, to the reality that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. I didn't smile. Revenge, at least for me, was never about satisfaction in someone's ruin. It was about balance, about making sure the scales, once tipped, were set right again. And as the lead agent slid the photo back into its sleeve, I realized something else. This was not the end. It was only the beginning of the story I had never planned to tell. I wish I could tell you my father's opinion of the military was born from ignorance. It wasn't. It was conviction. To him, the only meaningful battles were fought in boardrooms, over contracts, acquisitions, and market share. Success was measured in quarterly reports and the size of one's client list. In his mind, the uniform I wore was a symbol of wasted potential, a declaration that I had chosen servitude over ambition. From as early as I can remember, he had a plan for me. Private school to Ivy League, summer internships at his firm, a front row seat to the empire he was building so I could learn its inner workings before taking over. He even had a timeline for when I would join as a junior associate. It wasn't a suggestion, it was the shape my life was meant to take. My mother saw it differently. She was quiet in public but fierce in private, and she had a way of making me believe that my choices mattered. When I told her I wanted to serve, she didn't tell me I was wrong. She asked me why. I told her it wasn't about proving myself to anyone. It was about doing work that felt like it meant something. She listened. She smiled. And for a time, that was enough to shield me from the weight of my father's disappointment. She became my ally in small but critical ways. When my father dismissed my interest in the ROTC program, she was the one who encouraged me to attend the informational meeting anyway. When he scoffed at the idea of me waking up at 5 a.m. to run drills, she bought me my first pair of proper running shoes. And when I signed my enlistment papers, she was the one who came to the swearing-in, sitting in the front row, clapping until her hands turned red. That balance, her protection on one side, his disapproval on the other, shaped my early years more than I realized at the time. It taught me how to hold my ground without shouting, how to make choices quietly and stand by them. But balance doesn't last forever. She died suddenly, a heart attack. I was still in my first tour, stationed overseas. The call came in the middle of the night, the kind that leaves you staring at the wall long after the voice on the other end has gone silent. I took emergency leave, flew home, and walked into a house that no longer felt like mine. My father didn't greet me at the airport. He was too busy managing arrangements. The service was tasteful, expensive, and impersonal. Her life condensed into a program with her name printed in gold script. I stood at the podium to speak, only to feel the weight of his eyes on me, warning me not to make it personal, not to speak about things he didn't think belonged in public. I said what I needed to say anyway. Within months, he had remarried. She was younger than me by a handful of years, with perfect hair and a smile that never reached her eyes. Their wedding was held in the same house where my mother used to decorate for Christmas. I wasn't invited to stand beside him. I was seated near the back, introduced to guests as my daughter, the one in the army, as if my presence was a novelty. That was when I understood what the inner circle meant to my father. It wasn't about family, it was about loyalty to his world. My mother had been my only bridge to it, and with her gone, the drawbridge had been pulled up. I wasn't in the room where decisions were made. I wasn't consulted, I wasn't even informed. My life and my work were irrelevant unless they could be displayed as an asset in his social theater. The distance between us grew in ways that couldn't be measured in miles. Holidays became optional, phone calls were rare and brief. He stopped asking about my postings or promotions. I stopped offering the information. When we did speak, it was polite, transactional. Beneath the surface, there was an understanding that we lived in separate worlds, and he saw no reason to build a bridge between them. Looking back, I can see how these patterns hardened in both of us. His belief that my choices were a rejection of his legacy. My belief that his approval was something I neither wanted nor needed. We carried those convictions like armor, never realizing that one day they would be the very things that determined how we faced each other when everything finally came undone. And when that day came, it wasn't in a boardroom or on a battlefield. It was at a dinner table, under a crystal chandelier, with a single sentence meant to belittle me and a single decision that would change everything he thought he knew about who I was. I enlisted with a quiet certainty and quiet resolve that even I did not expect. Basic training stripped away whatever posturing I had. It left discipline, appetite for hard work, and a reflex that ran toward problems instead of away. I was not the fastest in my platoon. I learned to do small things right until the big things trusted me. When the commissioning board opened a path, I took it. The Army gave me languages. It gave me a map of places I had traced with a finger on paper as a child. Afghanistan taught me patience and precision. My first deployment began in a valley where radios failed every afternoon because the mountains swallowed our signal. We learned to move by timing and trust. I managed air deconfliction for a mixed convoy. After a rock slide cut the only road, the decision window was measured in heartbeats. No one cheered when we made it through. We inventoried supplies, signed the log, and slept in shifts. At dawn, I sketched altitudes and routes. I logged winds and rehearsed contingencies until they were muscle memory. The second tour removed my illusions about intelligence work. It is a corridor of maybe, a ledger of pencil clues, a circle of names shifting until one pattern holds. My team pulled threads from market chatter and diesel receipts. We found a storage yard that did not match the manifests. We pushed the finding up the chain with the caveat every good analyst learns to carry. A patrol avoided an ambush because of that memo. A week later, a report arrived in 3 lines. It did not name me. It meant someone got to go home. Promotions followed in the slow way that feels like bedrock. I accepted the pin with a short nod. I sent my mother's favorite words to myself in a private email I never shared. Do the work. Be where it counts. Calls with my father had thinned to weather and taxes. When he mentioned my career, he wore a polished half-smile. Medals are nice, Joanna. They mean nothing in the real world. He believed the real world lived in glass towers and corner offices. My real world fit inside a rucksack and a notebook. Later it fit inside a hard case with a sat phone and spare batteries. Africa widened it further. I learned the smell of a runway at noon and the weight of a generator at midnight. Floods cut the ground route to a clinic. Roads turned to rivers. Rumors swelled about theft at a supply depot. I sat with a local chief and a regional medic under a tin roof while rain hammered corrugated metal. We redrew the plan and moved supplies by helicopter in 2 lifts. Commendations arrived with the same quiet as the work that earned them. A ribbon pinned in a crowded room, a letter that named 3 actions and then shifted to budget notes, a handshake from a colonel who preferred brevity to ceremony. I kept the citations in a slim folder at the back of a drawer. On nights when power flickered, I took them out, not to feel important, but to reread the small mistakes I still wanted to fix and correct. The habit protected me from pride and from despair. I learned to take praise as data. I learned to grade myself by outcomes rather than applause. Distance does not only grow across oceans, it grows in pauses between sentences. When I flew home for brief windows, my father introduced me with a smile that carried a question mark. This is my daughter. She is in the Army. It sounded like a footnote. He asked about exit strategies and transferable skills. I answered politely. I did not hand him my stories. I kept them where they belonged, inside the people who lived them. Some lessons harden into a motif you can feel in your palm. Be where you are needed. Act without asking for credit. Leave things better than you found them. I did not design that as a brand. It became one. Command noticed. Teams noticed. General Marcus Hale noticed. Long before the night at my father's dinner, he watched me step in for an absent captain without announcement. He watched me close a loose loop before signing my name. Trust is not a speech. It is a ledger. Mine was not flashy. It was line after line of quiet completion. That is why, under the chandelier when his phone lit and my message appeared, he did not hesitate at all. He stood, he left, he lived. And I learned again the only rule that has never failed me. Show up when it matters, let the work speak, walk away without looking back. It was a week before the dinner when my father called. That alone was unusual. We were not in the habit of speaking without a reason. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, the same tone he used when addressing potential clients. "Joanna," he said, as though tasting the syllables for the first time in months, "there is a very important business dinner next Friday. I want you there." The words landed like a stone in still water, ripples of suspicion spreading outward. My father never invited me to events like this. The last time I had been at one of his corporate gatherings was years ago, seated at the far end of a long table, introduced in passing and quickly forgotten by the people who mattered in his world. "Why?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "You are my daughter. It is important for certain people to meet you." The pause that followed was deliberate. It would mean something. But he did not specify what it would mean or to whom. I knew better than to expect details. Part of me wanted to decline. I had enough on my plate. A new assignment had just dropped on my desk, and I was still closing out the after-action reports from my last field rotation. But something in his voice, a calculated mixture of pride and necessity, made me pause. There was an undercurrent there I could not quite read. "All right," I said finally, "I'll be there." I told myself it was a social obligation, a way to keep the fragile peace between us. You can attend one dinner, sit through the stories, smile politely, and walk away unchanged. That was the bargain I made with myself. The evening arrived with winter air sharp enough to sting. My father's driver met me at the curb outside my apartment, holding the door with a nod. The car's interior smelled faintly of leather and cedar, and the city slid past the tinted glass in streaks of light. The private club was tucked behind a row of unmarked facades on a narrow street where the traffic seemed to hush itself. From the outside, it was all restraint, brass handles, no signage. Inside, the world shifted. The entryway opened into a hall paneled in dark wood, polished to a sheen that reflected the low amber lighting. Oil paintings lined the walls, not generic landscapes, but portraits of men in tailored suits and women in gowns, each rendered with such detail you could almost hear the rustle of fabric. Their eyes seemed to follow you, a silent committee evaluating your worthiness to step further in. A hostess in a black dress greeted us with the kind of smile that was trained, not spontaneous. Her voice was soft enough to make you lean in to hear. "Right this way, Mr. Reed. Your table is prepared." The floor was carpeted thickly enough to swallow the sound of footsteps. Staff moved with precision, balancing trays of crystal glasses and silver cutlery. The scent in the air was a careful blend of something floral and something darker, perhaps tobacco leaf, designed to make you feel both welcome and slightly on edge. We passed a library room on the left, its walls lined with books bound in leather, spines stamped in gold. A fire crackled in the hearth, though no one sat near it. On the right, a small bar gleamed under recessed lights, bottles arranged like trophies. The dining room itself was a study in opulence. Long tables draped in white linen, each set with place cards in elegant script. The chairs were high-backed, upholstered in deep burgundy, the kind that forced you to sit straighter. Overhead, chandeliers hung low enough to catch the sparkle of the glassware. My father walked ahead of me, nodding to acquaintances, shaking hands with the kind of clasp that lasted just long enough to signal control. I followed, the click of my heels muffled by the carpet, taking in the way the room seemed to hum with understated competition. Every gesture, every glance was a transaction. He stopped at a table near the center of the room, one of the best positions for visibility. "You'll sit here," he said, pulling out a chair for me. His tone made it clear it was not a courtesy, it was placement. As I sat, I scanned the room, noting the clusters of conversation, the way people measured each other with quick assessments. I reminded myself why I was here. An evening of polite endurance, nothing more. Yet there was a tightness in my chest, a sense that this was not merely a dinner. It felt more like the opening move in a game I had not agreed to play. And somewhere deep down, a voice I had learned to trust whispered that I would need to pay attention. This night would not pass quietly. The longer I sat at the table, the more I noticed the patterns. Every high laugh was a little too measured. Every handshake was a little too long. It was the kind of room where everyone was trying to read everyone else without appearing to. A few faces I recognized from financial magazines and political segments on television, but there were others, Faces that meant nothing to me in a social sense, yet carried a certain weight. They wore expressions that did not match their voices. They scanned the room in calculated sweeps, eyes settling on each person as if assigning a value. When my father began introducing me to his guests, his tone was cool, almost perfunctory. "This is my daughter, Joanna. She is in the army." He said it the way some people might introduce a relative who collects stamps. An interesting but irrelevant fact. There was no mention of my rank, my service, or the places I had been. To him, the detail that mattered was that I wore a uniform, and even that he delivered like an afterthought. I extended my hand, offered a polite smile, and received nods in return. The small talk was predictable. "How long have you served? Do you plan to make a career of it?" None of them asked what I did or why I served. Still, I made a habit of listening more than speaking. Years in the field had taught me that conversations are rarely about the words spoken. They are about the words people choose not to say. Between the stock questions and the laughter, I caught hints of guarded subjects, of deals not yet public, of alliances being weighed. Halfway through a round of introductions, my father was called over to greet a late arrival. I found myself standing beside a man in a charcoal suit, his cufflinks catching the light with every subtle movement. He leaned slightly toward me, his voice pitched low enough that it did not carry beyond us. "Do you know who that is?" he asked, his chin lifting just enough to indicate someone across the room. I followed his line of sight. The man he meant was standing alone for the moment, near the service entrance, tall, lean, posture deceptively relaxed. I didn't need to look twice. 2 years ago, his photo had been taped to the inside of a briefing folder in Kabul. I had memorized it the way you memorize the face of a storm, because knowing it might give you a chance to survive it. A contract assassin linked to 3 confirmed kills across 3 continents. Interpol had issued a red notice, but he had vanished before anyone could act. I felt the muscles in my shoulders tighten, though my expression didn't change. "I know," I said quietly. The man beside me seemed to take my answer as a sign to say nothing more. He nodded once, then turned back to the group conversation as if our exchange had never happened. I stayed where I was, watching the assassin without staring. He was speaking to one of the servers, but his attention kept sliding toward the center of the room, toward a specific table where my father's most prominent guests sat. That was when I saw him notice someone else. General Marcus Hale, 4 stars, Army Chief of Staff. Hale was engaged in conversation, his back partially to the assassin. From where I stood, the line of sight was clear. My instincts began slotting the pieces together, the timing, the positioning, the fact that a man on Interpol's most wanted list was here at all. The room hadn't changed for anyone else. Laughter still rose and fell, cutlery still chimed against plates. But for me, the edges of the evening sharpened. I could feel the hum under the surface now, the one that told me this night was not going to end the way it was planned. I straightened slightly, enough to bring myself back into my father's peripheral vision. He was still deep in conversation, oblivious to the shift in the air. Whatever reason he had for inviting me here, I was beginning to suspect it was not the whole story. And whether he knew it or not, there was more at stake tonight than his reputation or his business deals. I set my water glass down, my hand steady. One thing the Army had taught me above all else was this: you never ignore a face you've been trained to remember, and you never assume a crowded room will keep you safe. The dinner was in full swing when my father began telling one of his stories. He always told them the same way, slow enough to command the table, just enough detail to make people lean in, and always ending with a line that served as both a punchline and a lesson. "People who build something real," he said, gesturing with his glass, "understand that money is made in the arena, not in the bleachers, not on a government salary." His eyes flicked toward me just long enough for the meaning to land. Real money, real success, doesn't come from following orders and collecting a paycheck from the taxpayers. A ripple of polite laughter moved around the table. I kept my expression neutral, my gaze steady on the rim of my water glass. Years of uniform inspections and mission briefings had trained me to hold my posture, even when the air grew heavy. If I let the words bite, they would only sink deeper. Instead, I let my eyes move across the room, mapping it the way I would a new operating area. Who was with whom? Who avoided whose gaze? The staff moved in precise lines between tables, refilling glasses without interrupting conversations. And then I saw him again. Near the far wall, partially obscured by the curve of a pillar, stood the man I had spotted earlier. The assassin. He wasn't mingling, wasn't pretending to be part of the event. He was watching. This time, I tracked his line of sight and felt my stomach tighten. General Marcus Hale was standing less than 15 feet away, speaking to the senator I'd seen him with earlier. The chandelier light caught the silver of his hair and the polished edge of his insignia. His posture was open, his attention fully on his companion. The assassin's attention was fully on him. My pulse quickened, but I forced my breathing to remain steady. Outwardly, I gave no sign that I had noticed anything at all. Inwardly, my mind was already sorting through options. Hale's aides were not in the immediate area. The general was unaware of the eyes on him. And this was not a place where anyone expected danger. That made it worse. I shifted slightly in my chair, enough to angle my view without drawing attention. My father was still talking, wrapping up his story with a flourish about the kind of risks only real leaders take. The table responded with another wave of laughter. I kept my eyes on the assassin. He moved only enough to avoid blocking a passing server, then returned to his post, scanning the crowd, but always coming back to Hale. I could tell by his stance, weight evenly balanced, one shoulder slightly turned, that he was trained. This wasn't curiosity, this was surveillance with intent. And there, in the center of that polished, glittering room, under the hum of business deals and social games, I understood that the night had shifted. I glanced toward my father. He was basking in the attention of his audience, utterly unaware of the quiet threat just a few yards away. I wondered, not for the first time, whether he would even believe me if I told him. I didn't move yet. Acting too soon could be as dangerous as acting too late. Timing mattered. In the army, we call it waiting for the window, those few seconds when action has the best chance of success. The laughter at our table began to fade as a waiter arrived with the next course. Silver domes lifted in unison, releasing the scent of seared meat and rosemary. My father reached for his knife, turning his attention to his plate. I allowed myself one more look at the assassin. His gaze had narrowed now, his focus sharper, like a camera lens locking onto a subject. The room still didn't know. Hale still didn't know. But I did, and I knew this. If the window opened, I would be ready. The window opened in a breath. I took it. I slid my phone from the clutch, held it beneath the linen, and opened the secure thread built for emergencies. No one could predict, and no one could ignore. My thumbs were steady. The message was simple. It had to be simple. Get up and leave. Now. Don't ask why. I pressed send. The screen dimmed. The phone vanished under the fold of the tablecloth. My face stayed impassive. I lifted my water as if nothing had changed. Across the room, General Marcus Hale paused mid-sentence. His hand moved to his inner pocket. He glanced down without breaking posture. Our eyes met for a heartbeat. Acknowledgement, trust, movement. He rose from his chair. "Senator, we will finish this tomorrow," he said. His tone was even and casual. He buttoned his jacket and turned toward the corridor that led past the bar. Conversations did not stop. They thinned. A 4-star general was leaving before the main course. My father's fork hovered above his plate. "What is that about?" he asked low. I cut a small piece of meat and did not answer. The assassin pushed off the wall with quiet purpose. He angled toward the corridor on an intercept line. His expression was nothing. His steps were water on tile. Then the aides appeared. I had not seen where they came from. That was the point. One moved to shadow the general's shoulder. The other approached from the side with the unhurried energy of a man heading for the restroom. The assassin adjusted half a step. The corridor narrowed. Geometry turned against him. My father tried for a laugh. It was thin. "Leaving early, even generals have bedtimes," he said. No one answered. I dabbed my napkin and tracked the corridor with peripheral vision. The first aide greeted the assassin as if they were acquaintances. The second shifted to block the exit with a courteous sidestep. Hale never broke stride. He turned the corner and disappeared. A current moved through the dining room, the kind you feel more than see. In the corridor, a soft exchange hardened. The assassin angled away. The aides flowed with him, every gesture polite, every inch decisive. 3 men paused near the service door. A 4th arrived from the kitchen hall. A manager mentioned a private call. The door opened. The door closed. The corridor emptied. Most people saw only courtesy and logistics. They registered the absence of a powerful man and the return of calm. To them, the evening resumed. To me, the wiring had been changed. My father leaned closer. "Did you say something to him?" he asked. The question was a knife wrapped in velvet. I let steam blur the edge of my vision. I gave a small shrug. "He remembered something, that is all. Be." Across the room, the senator checked his watch. The hostess lifted a phone. 2 security staff who had not existed 5 minutes earlier stood where a painting cast an oval of shadow. The assassin was gone. The aides were gone. Pressure bled from the air. My pulse lagged. I forced my breathing into cadence. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. I swallowed water that tasted like nothing. The trick to a silent move is not the action. It is the denial afterward. Deny the spike its echo, and people convince themselves there was never a spike at all. The room obliged, volume returned, jokes resumed, deals reknit their threads. My father lifted his glass in a small toast. "To leaders who understand the value of staying in the room," he said. His gaze touched mine for a fraction. He wanted me to flinch. I did not. I set my fork down. I folded my hands. I let the wave pass. Inside the quiet, one fact settled. A single text had moved a 4-star general. A single decision had rebalanced the night. No announcement, no applause. Only a quiet pivot that kept the wrong man from reaching the right target. That was enough. Later, my father rebuilt the scaffolding of charm. He resumed the story he had paused. People laughed on cue. Every so often, his eyes slid to the corridor and back to me, as if he could hear an echo he preferred to ignore. I kept my expression mild and asked the waiter for coffee. The cup arrived hot. It tasted steady and clean. The room decided to forget. I did not. The window had closed. The calculus had changed. The rest of the night would follow the track I set without anyone noticing the rail had moved. Under the chandelier, I understood that the storm had been delayed, not cancelled. Morning would bring the proof. The knock came just after sunrise, not a neighbor's tap, not the casual rhythm of a delivery. It was the kind of knock that landed in your chest. 3 sharp bursts, a pause, then 3 more. I was already dressed. Sleep had been light, my mind replaying the movement of the night before, the corridor, the aides, the way the assassin's gaze had locked on Marcus Hale. I walked to the porch with my coffee in hand, the steam curling into the cold air. From the top step I could see them. Black SUVs lined along the curb, doors open, engines idling. Men and women in dark jackets stepped out with quick, synchronized efficiency. Interpol was printed in white on their backs. They didn't waste time with introductions. The front gate swung open. The sound of boots on stone echoed across the driveway. I stayed where I was, letting the scene unfold without inserting myself into it. The front door opened, and my father appeared in the frame. He was wearing a robe, his hair uncombed, his expression stuck between irritation and confusion. He started to speak, but the lead agent stepped forward, holding a leather folder. "Mr. Reed," the agent said. His voice was calm, clipped, every syllable precise. He opened the folder, slid out a photograph, and held it up. My father's eyes dropped to the image. Whatever was left of his morning composure fell with them. His mouth parted, but no sound came. His shoulders dipped, as though the weight of the paper was pressing on him from a distance. I already knew what it was before I saw the angle of the print. It was him, standing in a narrow corridor, shaking hands with the man from last night, the assassin I had identified the moment I saw him in the club. The background was unmistakable, same wall paneling, same brass light fixtures. The agent did not elaborate. He didn't have to. Behind him, the rest of the team began their sweep. 2 went upstairs, another disappeared toward the kitchen. Radios crackled in short bursts. Evidence bags emerged from pockets. Drawers opened and closed with methodical efficiency. The whole house was being taken apart, layer by layer. I leaned against the porch railing, taking a sip of coffee. The taste was bitter and grounding. From here, I could hear the cadence of the agents' movements, the way their boots struck the hardwood in unison. They were not here to search. They were here to clear. My father finally found his voice. "What is this? What are you doing in my home?" The words were aimed at the lead agent, but they wavered. He was trying to project authority, and it was sliding off the walls. The agent's gaze didn't shift. "We have other materials, but I think this image is sufficient for now." He slipped the photo back into its sleeve and returned it to the folder. I watched my father's eyes flick, almost involuntarily, toward where I stood. Just for a second. And in that second, a tangle of emotions crossed his face. Recognition, accusation, something else I couldn't name. I didn't move. The operation inside continued. A laptop was carried down the stairs, cables still dangling. A locked case from his study was unlatched, its contents photographed before being sealed into evidence bags. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up. Curtains shifted in nearby windows. Someone's dog barked twice and fell silent. The air smelled faintly of frost and exhaust. I thought about the night before, about how fast everything had shifted. One text, one movement, and the threads had unraveled this far by morning. When the agents began filing out with their secured items, the lead paused at the threshold. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Reed," he said. It wasn't a courtesy. It was a statement of fact. My father stood rooted in place, the robe's belt hanging loose, his face pale under the early light. From the porch, I finished my coffee, set the empty cup on the railing, and stepped down to the walkway. Passing him, I caught the faintest trace of the cologne he always wore to meetings. It smelled the same, but the man wearing it wasn't. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The photograph had done the talking. The rest of the day would do the rest. He spoke first. The front door was still open. Cold air brushed the hall. The last agent crossed the threshold. My father turned toward me with a face I knew from press photos. It was the face he wore when a deal slipped. His voice did not match the face. It shook. "What did you do?" "Not me," I said. "You did this." The words hung between us like a tape line across a doorway. He studied my expression, hunting for a clause he could amend. I offered none. He tried again, softer now, the tone he reserved for juries he wanted to guide. "Joanna, be reasonable. This is a misunderstanding. Someone made a mistake." "They showed you a photograph," I said. "They did not bring rumors. They brought proof." He flinched as if I had laid a hand on him. "You think a handshake means a conspiracy. That man could have forced the greeting. People do that. They stage a picture. They create a lie. This is my house. This is my life." I kept my voice level. "You invited me to a dinner where a 4-star general was present. A known contract killer was also present. Interpol does not execute a warrant because someone brushed your hand in a corridor." He stared past me at the street as if the morning could write him a better answer. The silence lengthened. Finally, he reached for the line he used in other emergencies. "Family does not do this to family." "Family does not hire killers," I said. "Family does not launder money through shell companies. Family does not gamble with a life that is not theirs." His shoulders lifted and fell. Then the strategist returned, the man who treated pressure like air. He stepped closer, the robe brushing the tile. "If you said something to that general, undo it. You still have time. Tell them it was a mistake. Say you misread a face in a crowded room." "You want me to recant what I saw with trained eyes," I said. "You want me to lie so a story you prefer can survive." The front gate clicked shut. The house sounded hollow without the confidence that used to live in it. "I am your father," he said. "You owe me loyalty." "I owe the living the chance to stay alive," I said. "I owe the uniform the truth. I owe myself the quiet that comes when I act on what I know." He looked at me the way men look at a verdict they cannot appeal. "You have always judged me," he said. "You chose a life that rejects mine." "I chose a life that does not need applause to be real," I said. The debate did not end at the door. By afternoon, the calls began. A cousin wanted to know if I had turned on my own blood. An old classmate sent one word, "hero," with a question mark. A colleague texted 3 words, "You did right." A talk radio host framed the story as loyalty versus law. Callers split in equal parts. Online strangers chose teams. Some said I had sold out family, others said I had saved a life. Both claimed the moral high ground. The agents returned for a brief follow-up. My father refused to sit. He paced the foyer and demanded names. He asked about jurisdiction. The lead agent repeated the phrase, "cross-border predicate offenses," and said nothing else. When they left, the house felt smaller, as if the walls had shifted inward. In the evening, he tried a different angle. He spoke about appearances. He warned me about headlines. He predicted ruin not only for him, but for me. "Think about your record," he said. "Think about what this does to your career." "My record is built on showing up when it counts," I said. Today counted. Dusk pulled the color from the windows. The rooms took on that museum quality they always had. Beautiful and uninhabited. I stood to go. He reached as if to stop me, then let his hand fall. For a heartbeat, his voice softened. "Tell me there is a way back." "There is always a way back," I said. "It begins with the truth." He did not answer. I stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind me. The air felt clean. I saw my reflection in the glass and the outline of the house. I walked to the gate and did not look back, because some decisions only hold if you keep walking. Behind me, the house settled into silence. Ahead of me, the street felt open. Once my path belonged to me. The investigation moved faster than I expected. By the end of the first week, Interpol and the Domestic Task Force had linked my father to a string of transactions spread across 4 countries. The pattern was there for anyone who knew where to look. Payments routed through shell corporations, layered transfers that bounced between banks in jurisdictions famous for secrecy, and investments disguised as consulting fees. The reports were clinical. Each entry was a date, a sum, a movement from one account to another. But I could see the shape of it forming, like a map sketched in reverse. They were following the money back to its origin, stripping away the layers he had built to make it look legitimate. One of the investigators, a woman with a calm voice and eyes that missed nothing, explained that the funds had been washed through boutique investment firms. These weren't large, flashy institutions. They were quiet operations, the kind you only knew about if someone invited you in. They promised high returns for select clients, and left the rest to paperwork that looked impeccable until you studied the signatures. I sat in the back of the briefing room while she spoke, taking in the numbers on the screen. The amounts varied, sometimes just enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts, other times bold enough to suggest confidence in their cover. What they all had in common was that they moved in a circle, always returning to accounts that could be traced to someone in my father's orbit. It was strange sitting there, knowing the man they were talking about was the same man who once lectured me about paying credit card bills on time. In his world, appearances were everything, and he had built a version of himself that could pass any casual inspection. That was when the memories started to align. I remembered being home on leave a few years ago, walking into his study to drop off a folder he'd asked for. He was on the phone, speaking in that clipped tone he used when he didn't want to be overheard. "The plan is still on track," he said. "No, I'm not worried about the timing." At the time, I assumed it was a business project, maybe a merger or a property deal. His work had always been filled with terms I didn't follow closely. He had waved me off with a nod, covering the receiver with his palm until I left the room. Another time, I caught part of a conversation while passing his office door. "We'll move it before the quarter ends," he said, then paused to listen. "No, they won't notice, not if we do it right." Again, I told myself it was the language of business, risk management, strategy, the kind of talk that didn't apply to me. Now, in the context of what the investigators were showing, those fragments read differently. They weren't harmless negotiations. They were checkpoints in a chain of illegal movements, each one disguised as something legitimate. The agent clicked to another slide, an organizational chart mapping the entities involved. My father's name didn't appear at the top. It never would. But the connections radiated toward him through a network of associates, some of whom I recognized from the dinner, others from photographs in old business journals. They were careful. No single person handled more than one step in the chain. The money moved like a relay, passed from one hand to the next, before disappearing into an account under a different name. It was a system built for deniability. Still, patterns leave a shadow, and shadows leave a trail. As the presentation wrapped up, the lead investigator made it clear that the evidence wasn't just circumstantial. There were signed documents, recorded calls, and emails that, while vague in language, matched the timing of the transfers. Every piece was being cross-referenced with surveillance from the night of the dinner. I kept my questions to myself. It wasn't my job to tell them how to do theirs, but I couldn't ignore the thread that ran through it all. My father's need to control outcomes. Whether it was a corporate deal or a criminal enterprise, he treated it like a chess game, confident that he could move the pieces without anyone seeing the whole board. Walking out of the briefing, I thought again about those phone calls, about how easy it had been for me to accept his explanations, or to not ask for any at all. In my work, I was trained to see connections others missed, but with him, I had let familiarity dull my edge. That wouldn't happen again. The picture was only the beginning. The files that followed told a story more complicated than greed. In the second week, the task force briefed me in a plain room that smelled of dry markers and coffee. The lead investigator traced a pressure arc. My father had not simply chased profit. He had taken money to plug a hole that should not have existed, then learned the lender was not a lender at all. The name on the slide was redacted, but the outline was clear. A financier with diplomatic cover, a patron of arts in public, a broker of violence in private. Years earlier, a client of my father's firm imploded under fraud allegations. Settlements loomed. The capital line tightened. Pride blocked any admission of risk. A discreet facility appeared, a bridge loan with generous terms. The terms changed. Interest became leverage. Leverage became control. By the time my mother died, the debt had expanded into obligation. The financier used galas and policy forums as hunting grounds. He collected proximity to power and a portfolio of leverage. According to emails the agents recovered, my father stalled several demands. He delayed introductions. He sent small payments as signals he was still cooperative. The pattern held until the request that intersected my life. Arrange access to the senator and to General Hale on the same evening. I asked the investigator whether my father knew violence was on the table. She paused, then answered with care. He may not have known the method. He could not have missed the possibility. The financier had a history of using contractors when leverage failed. The assassin's travel matched the patron's itinerary for 2 previous events on 2 continents. The dots did not require imagination. They required the honesty to name what power does when it is cornered. Shame is a poor architect. It builds rooms with no doors. Looking back, I remembered gestures that never fit a clean narrative. A call my father made after midnight the winter before, his voice raw. Leave her out of this. She is not leverage. A donation to a security foundation filed under a friend's name. Later, the foundation funded protective training for a judge who had ruled against the patron's ally. At the time, I assumed he was signaling virtue. Now I saw a man pushing back without naming the danger, hoping that half measures could hold it at the door. The agents found bank drafts that covered the tuition of a paralegal's son, the paralegal who managed travel for the patron's executive assistant. They found a second phone in my father's office, safe with a schedule app behind a simple code. The calendar listed charity luncheons and 2 funerals. Beneath each entry sat a 2-letter tag that matched wire transfers routed through art brokers. It was elegant in the way rot looks elegant from a distance, tidy columns masking the smell. I would like to tell you the discovery softened me. It did not. It complicated me. I could hold 2 truths at once. He had broken the law. He had also tried, in crooked ways, to blunt the harm. Those efforts did not absolve him. They mapped the size of the trap. He had stepped in with arrogance and stayed in with fear. The leash tightened each time he pretended it was a necklace. One afternoon, the prosecutor asked whether I would consider a statement on character. I said I would speak to the facts I knew. I would not launder motives. She nodded and closed her folder. On the way out, she mentioned something I had not known. Months before the dinner, my father declined an invitation to a private retreat hosted by the patron. His refusal earned him a warning dressed as courtesy. The message was simple: pay with money or pay with blood. When the agents interviewed staff from the club, a server remembered a curious instruction from a man on the event team. Keep the corridor by the service door clear at 9:20. Do not let the bar cart linger. Another staffer recalled being told to dim the sconces to 50% at 9:15. Small adjustments, precise timing, a room arranged to erase seconds, the kind of edit that gives a contractor just enough space to act and vanish. I drove home through a light rain that turned the traffic lights into soft halos. My father once told me every choice is a ledger, costs on one side, benefits on the other. He believed he could keep the numbers balanced by moving columns. The investigation suggested a harsher arithmetic. Some debts collect themselves and bring friends. At night, I replayed fragments I had ignored. His phrase during those old calls returned with a colder meaning. The plan is still on track. I had thought he meant a merger. Now I understood he had been trying to keep wolves from the table without admitting wolves existed. If there was a seed of redemption in him, it lived in that denial. He wanted the danger to be containable so we would not see it. The truth did not free him. It freed my judgment and my mercy. The courthouse smelled like paper and disinfectant, a neutral film meant to scrub away whatever people carried inside. Reporters crowded the steps, microphones poised, cameras blinking red. I kept my gaze forward. I signed into the witness room. The clock above the door ticked like a metronome. Inside, the gallery filled early. The prosecution table was a small city of binders. Tabs marked routes through the evidence. The defense relied on a yellow legal pad and a glass of water. My father sat between two attorneys in navy suits. He looked at the judge. He looked at the press. He did not look at me. The judge entered. We rose. We sat. The clerk read the case number and charges. Conspiracy to launder money, wire fraud, providing material support to a violent contractor. Each count landed. The words were heavy. The government called its witnesses. A forensic accountant traced transactions through boutique funds. Her cadence turned numbers into maps. A manager from the private club explained the floor plan, the service corridor, an instruction to dim the sconces at 9:15. An Interpol agent authenticated the photograph. He detailed chain of custody. The screen filled with timestamps. When they called my name, I walked to the stand with my hands at my sides. I swore. The Bible was cool under my palm. The oath was plain. The prosecutor's notes were spare, her questions precise. State your name and occupation. Major Joanna Reed, United States Army. She asked me to describe the dinner, the tone of the room, the moment I identified the assassin, the secure text I sent to General Hale, what I observed when he rose, how the aides appeared, how the atmosphere thinned. I answered in plain language, only sequence and fact. When she asked why Hale trusted a message with no explanation, I told the truth. He has watched me show up where I was needed without credit. She asked whether my father knew of the assassin's presence. I cannot speak to his knowledge, I said. I can speak to what I saw. A 4-star general and a known contractor inside the same space. A corridor adjusted on a precise schedule. The defense attorney rose with a measured smile. He asked whether I resented my father's world, whether service had narrowed my view, whether I saw threats by training. I kept my tone steady. I report, I do not project. I recognized a face memorized in Kabul. I acted to remove a target. That was all. He lifted the photograph. A handshake can be staged, can it not? A photograph is a moment, I said. The investigation is a pattern. He let the words sit. He moved on. When I stepped down, the gallery rustled. The judge's gavel drew a straight line through the sound. By afternoon, the prosecution rested. The defense called a hospital administrator who spoke about a wing my father funded, a professor who praised scholarships, a partner who said my father solved problems. Their kindness did not erase the ledgers on the screen. Then the air shifted. My father stood. He leaned toward counsel. He asked to address the court. The judge studied him, then allowed a narrow statement. He faced the bench. His voice was clear. He did not chase sympathy. He described pressure that turned into threat. A bridge loan that became a leash, an evening he thought he could manage. He offered a single line that cut through the room. I tried to keep the wolves off my table by asking them to wait on the porch. The prosecutor returned to the lectern. Were you asked to facilitate proximity to General Hale? She said. Yes. Did you understand that a contractor might be used? A long breath, then one word. Yes. A murmur rolled across the gallery, cameras tilted. The judge's gavel restored the surface. Counsel conferred. A plea discussion began in full view. Numbers stayed off the record. Consequences did not. When court recessed, the hallway felt colder than the morning. Reporters called my name. I offered no comment. Outside, the sky held flat winter light. I stood for one count. Then I walked to the sidewalk, my pace even, my face unreadable. The story would be the facts, not my expression, not his. I had answered what I saw. I had kept my promise to the uniform and to the part of me that refuses to trade clarity for comfort. In the quiet after the gavel, I felt the strange clarity that follows hard truth. Whatever came next would belong to the record. My task was simple: keep faith with the facts and with myself and with service. The judge called for a brief recess. The bailiff's voice cut through the shuffle, and chairs scraped against the polished floor. My father stayed seated while his attorneys leaned in, whispering fast. He didn't look at them. Instead, for the first time in years, his eyes found mine. The usual steel and sly amusement were gone. No smirk, no edge, just a long, unguarded look that landed heavier than any sentence could. It wasn't remorse, not the open kind, But something had shifted. I could see it in the way his shoulders weren't squared for show, in how he didn't try to stare me down as if this were another one of our private contests. There was an absence of performance, as if the energy to pretend had finally burned out. When court resumed, his lead counsel stood and announced, "Your Honor, my client wishes to change his plea on several counts." A ripple moved through the gallery. Reporters reached for phones, their fingers flying. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed, scanning her notes. The judge raised an eyebrow but nodded for the defense to proceed. My father stood, slow but steady, and faced the bench. His voice carried without strain. "On the charges of conspiracy and material support, I plead guilty." The air shifted. He didn't flinch at the sound of pens scratching or the camera shutters clicking in bursts. Then he added, "I do so with the understanding that others who acted under my direction, without knowledge of the full scope, will not be prosecuted." It was a calculated move, but not purely strategic. The names he was shielding weren't strangers. Some were longtime employees, a cousin who had worked the books without knowing where the numbers led, and even one of the waitstaff from that dinner who had been told to keep the lights low. By accepting the bulk of the responsibility, he was cutting the cord that could have pulled them into the same current. He didn't mention me, not in a plea for my safety, not as a bargaining chip. But the omission said enough. If he'd wanted to drag me down, he could have. By twisting the interpretation of my warning to Marcus Hale, by suggesting I had acted outside my orders, by feeding the defense a theory of collusion. He didn't. And in this room, silence could be as deliberate as speech. The prosecutor conferred with her team, then addressed the judge. "We will honor the agreement, provided the defendant's cooperation is complete and verifiable." My father gave a single nod. There was no triumph in it, just acceptance. I sat in the witness row, watching the man who had built a life on never yielding stand in open court and admit to acts that would strip him of control, freedom, and reputation. His tie was still perfect, but it hung differently now. No longer part of an armor, but a remnant of a role he couldn't play anymore. The judge asked if this plea was made willingly, without coercion. "Yes," my father said. Was he satisfied with counsel's advice? Yes. Did he understand the consequences? A pause, and then, "I do." The gavel's tap made it official. For a moment after, there was no sound but the quiet hum of the lights. Then the judge set a date for sentencing. The attorneys gathered their papers. The gallery began to buzz again, but I stayed still, taking in the rare image of my father, not as the man in control, but as a man who had made a choice, one that, for once, didn't center on his own survival. He didn't look at me again before the bailiff led him toward the holding area. I didn't expect him to. The connection had already happened, in that brief, unspoken exchange before recess, a recognition that didn't require apology to be real. It was the first time he hadn't tried to win, the first time he'd let a piece of himself be cut away without demanding someone else pay for it. Walking out of the courthouse, the cold air hit my face like a reset. The press swarmed, asking what I thought of his plea. I said nothing. This wasn't about public reaction, not for me. It was about a man who had spent a lifetime dismissing my judgment, finally choosing, in his own way, not to turn me into collateral damage. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't reconciliation, but it was a decision that kept me standing on my own side of the line, and that was enough. Sometimes, in a life like mine, the absence of betrayal can feel as close to redemption as you're ever going to get. A year had passed since the trial. My days had settled into a steady rhythm, briefings at dawn, operations that took me into classified corridors, evenings that belonged to my own quiet routines. I hadn't thought much about my father beyond what the news occasionally reported. Inmate transfers, an appeal denied, a health check that hinted at aging faster behind bars. Then one morning, a plain envelope arrived at my office. No return address, but the handwriting on it stopped me mid-step. Sharp, deliberate strokes, his handwriting. I turned the envelope over twice before sliding a letter opener along the seam. The paper inside was lined, folded with a precision that was almost military. The first sentence read, "I never thought you had that kind of strength." I stared at it for a long time, the words swimming slightly as the sunlight angled across my desk. He had written more, pages of it in fact. He talked about the food, the noise, the constant trade of favors that prison life revolved around. He mentioned books he'd read, faces he'd come to recognize, and a certain discipline he was trying to keep. But every few paragraphs, he circled back to me, to that night at the dinner table, to the moment Marcus rose and left at my instruction. He asked what had tipped me off, whether I had been trained to see it coming, whether someone had warned me. And then, as if the questions were smoke dissipating in a gust, he admitted something I had never expected him to say in writing. That part of him was glad I had done it, even if it had brought the entire structure of his life crashing down. Still, the line that stood apart, framed by the space above and below it, was that first one. I never thought you had that kind of strength. I folded the letter back up and slid it into its envelope. I didn't draft a reply. Not because I was angry, and not because I wanted him to wonder. I didn't respond because strength, as he called it, wasn't what had moved me that night. It was something older, slower, built over years, in the absence of his approval, something that didn't need his label to exist. Strength implied I had overpowered something. What I'd done was the opposite. I had refused to be pulled into his orbit, refused to let his choices dictate my safety, or the safety of those under my watch. That wasn't about force. That was about trust. Trust in my own judgment, and in the foundation I had laid brick by brick when no one else cared to see it. I set the envelope in my desk drawer, beneath a file that would keep it from plain sight. If I ever read it again, it would be years from now. For now, it was enough to know the words existed. As the day moved on, the letter became just another detail, folded into the life I had built without his permission. I went back to the briefing room, my coffee cooling beside the mission map. My colleagues talked through contingencies, and I listened, making notes where I needed to. No one there knew about the envelope in my drawer, and they didn't have to. Some truths don't need an audience. Time didn't pause after the letter. It never does. My service continued. My life kept its pace. Deployments rotated in and out. Files crossed my desk in coded stacks. I lived alone, not out of isolation, but out of choice, shaping my own space without echoes from the past. My father lost everything, the companies, the estates, the thin network of people who had once smiled because his name carried weight. There was no satisfaction in watching that happen. I didn't savor it the way some might expect. What I felt was lighter, a lifting of a burden I hadn't realized I'd been carrying on my shoulders since I was old enough to understand his world was dangerous. Every so often, the memory of that dinner would surface unprompted. Not the chaos afterward, not the headlines, but the split second Marcus stood and left without asking why. That was the real proof. The quiet evidence that I didn't need my father's recognition to be heard, to be trusted. I had built that trust on my own. It became a private motif I carried with me, one moment, one movement, that reaffirmed I could navigate crisis without waiting for anyone to grant me authority. The people who mattered listened. That was enough. The seasons turned, and life kept unfolding. My work took me to places I can't name, introduced me to people I'll never see again after the mission ended. But in the small hours, when the city was quiet and the sky was just beginning to pale, I would sometimes think of how quickly that moment at the table had come and gone, and how lasting its imprint had been. If you told me years ago that my closure with my father wouldn't come from a conversation or an apology, I might have laughed. But closure had arrived in fragments. The shift in his eyes before the plea, the silence where he could have dragged me down, the letter he sent a year later. None of those things were redemption on their own, but together they formed something close enough for me to let go. I don't live my life waiting for reconciliation now. I don't measure my worth by the gaps in someone else's approval. I measure it by the lives I protect, the integrity I refuse to trade, and the moments when the people I trust act without hesitation because they know I wouldn't lead them into harm. As for my father, I don't know if I'll see him again. The future has a way of folding in unexpected meetings, but I won't plan for it. If it happens, I'll be ready. If it doesn't, I already have what I need. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, we hope you carry this story with you, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. I know that now. And that's why the last words I'll leave you with are simple, the same ones I live by. I choose my ground and I stand.